How would you describe a task that is very easy to accomplish? We call it a piece of cake. How would you express complete agreement with someone's statement or proposal? You say, absolutely. How would you indicate that someone should go ahead of you or take their turn first? The polite phrase is, after you. How would you express a consistent or constant behavior or occurrence? You would use the word always. How would you describe something that is impressive, extraordinary, or awe-inspiring? The perfect word is amazing. How do you ask someone to continue their story or explanation? You just say, and then. How do you ask for suggestions or creative solutions to a problem? You can ask, any good ideas? How would you respond to someone's request, indicating that you are available and willing to help? You can simply say, anytime. How do you inquire if anyone is present in the house or room? You'd call out, anybody home? How do you ask if there is anything additional needed or required? You ask, anything else? How do you ask someone if they are waiting in a queue? You might ask, are you in line? How do you express disbelief or surprise? Often implying that you find a situation hard to believe or accept. You might exclaim, are you kidding? How do you ask someone if they are telling the truth or if they are earnest about a situation or statement? You might inquire, are you serious? How would you express relief or satisfaction when something anticipated or desired finally happens? You'd say, at last. How would you get people's focus and request their immediate attention? You'd announce, attention, please. How would you express excitement, enthusiasm, or admiration towards something or someone? You'd shout, awesome. How would you ask someone to provide support or assistance in a situation or argument? You'd say, back me up. How would you give someone permission to do something or invite them to do as they please? You'd offer, be my guest. What advice would you give me when I'm anxious for the test results? You'd say, be patient. What would you advise someone constantly late to meetings? You'd tell them, be punctual. What would you say if you need to put a phone call on hold briefly? You'd say, be right back with you. What do you say to people when they enter your office for a meeting? You'd tell them, be seated. What's a less polite way of telling someone to go away? You might say, beat it. What would you say to order a drink at a bar? You'd simply say, beer, please. What do you tell your little brother before you take him to a formal event? You'd say, behave yourself. What do you say when someone arrives late but finally completes a task? You'd say, better late than never. What's your response to receiving a smaller bonus than expected? You'd say, better than nothing. How would you express intense physical pain? You'd exclaim, boy, it hurts. What would you say to stop a fight? You'd shout, break it up. How would you ask someone to use your nickname instead of your full name? You'd say, call me Sam, please. How do you ask someone if they could transport you in their vehicle? The answer is, can I get a ride? How do you ask someone to predict or make an educated guess about something? The answer is, can you guess? How do you check if someone is able to hear you clearly during a conversation? Often over a call or through a microphone. The answer is, can you hear me now? How do you request assistance or support from someone? The answer is, can you help me? What would you say if you completely agree with an undeniable fact? The answer is, can't argue with that. How would you describe an experience that is at its utmost perfection? The answer is, can't be better than this. How do you ask someone to choose their method of payment, either using cash or a credit debit card? The answer is, cash or charge. How would you say goodbye if you plan to see the person soon? The answer is, catch you later. How do you respond when someone asks if they can borrow a book? The answer is, certainly. What would you say when you want to pay for a purchase with your credit card? The answer is, charge it, please.
What would you say to encourage a friend to look at something interesting? You'd say, check it out. How would you request the bill in a restaurant? You'd say, check, please. What would you say to a friend who's feeling down? You'd say, cheer up. What do you say when you raise your glass to make a toast? You'd say, cheers. How do you ask for coffee in a cafe? You'd say, coffee, please. How do you announce that dinner is ready? You'd say, come and get it. What do you say when someone knocks on your door? You'd say, come on in. What do you say when you want someone to hurry up? You'd say, come on. What do you say to someone who just graduated college? You'd say, congratulations. What's your response when your friend shows you their new gadget? You'd say, cool. What do you say when you're not sure about the answer to a question? Could be. How would you describe an ideal situation? Couldn't be better than this. Do you think you'll pass the exam? Definitely. How was the new dessert at the bakery? Delicious. Will you come to the party tonight? Depends. How do you ask if someone received something or understood a concept or information you provided? Did you get it? How do you express frustration or incredulity when someone doesn't seem to have understood or followed your instructions? Didn't I make myself clear? What was your reaction to the spoiled food? Disgusting. How do you ask if you have knowledge of something, or if you are supposed to recognize something? Do I know it? How do you ask for someone's opinion on your appearance? Do I look all right? How do you ask if someone understands what you're saying or explaining? You may say, do you follow me? How do you inquire if someone has brought all the necessary items with them? You may say, do you have everything with you? How do you ask someone if they also do something? Usually used as a follow-up to a statement you've made about yourself. You may say, do you? How do you ask about someone's well-being, or how they're coping with a situation? You may say, doing okay? What advice would you give to someone who is overthinking a situation? You may say, don't get too serious. What would you say to someone who is hesitant about taking a good opportunity? You may say, don't miss the boat. What would you tell someone who is taking too many risks? You may say, don't press your luck. What would you say when you don't want to explain why you're upset? You may say, don't ask. What would you say to encourage a friend who is scared to try something new? You may say, don't be a chicken. What do you tell a child who is scared of the dark? You may say, don't be afraid. What would you tell someone making imprudent decisions? You may say, don't be foolish. What do you say to someone who's understating their achievements? You may say, don't be modest. What advice would you give to a person hesitant to speak at a meeting? You may say, don't be shy. What would you tell someone who is unnecessarily worrying over something? You may say, don't be silly. What would you say when you're busy and someone's disturbing you? You may say, don't bother me. What would you say if you don't need help with something? You may say, don't bother. What would you say when someone tries to divert a discussion? You may say, don't change the subject. What do you say to calm a friend who's getting angry? You may say, don't get upset. What do you say to emphasize the importance of trust in a situation? You may say, don't let me down. What would you say to a ridiculous suggestion? You may say, don't make me laugh. What would you say to warn someone about your patience limits? You may say, don't mess with me. What could you say if you're feeling pressured? You may say, don't push me. What would you tell someone who is taking unnecessary risks? You may say, don't push your luck. What do you say when people are shoving in a crowded place? You may say, don't push. What do you say to someone who is considering stirring up a stable situation? You may say, don't rock the boat. What do you tell a friend who's concerned about a minor mistake they made? You may say, don't worry about it. What do you say when your friend is leaving in their car? You may say, drive safely. How do you advise someone to slow down and be careful? You may say, easy does it. What do you say when serving someone food at a restaurant? You may say, enjoy your meal. What do you say when you want a bad behavior to stop? You may say, enough is enough.
How would you respond if someone perfectly described your thoughts on a topic? You may say, exactly. How do you express approval of a job well done? You may say, excellent. What do you say to get someone's attention politely in public? You may say, excuse me. How would you respond if someone inaccurately described you as an extrovert? You may say, far from it. How would you describe a situation with equal chances of success and failure? You may say, 50-50. What do you say when you want someone to come with you? You may say, follow me. How do you ask if a change or situation is permanent? You may say, for good. How do you ask about the reason or purpose for something? You may say, for what? What do you say when you no longer want to discuss an upsetting topic? You may say, forget it. What do you instruct someone to do when to raise a queue? You may say, get in the line.